So guys, last night I was lucky enough to be ringside for the Frank Warren bill at the York Hall. Afterwards I went for a bit of a curry and a few beers in Brick Lane, so feeling slightly worse for wear today, but nevertheless had a good evening on the whole. And before I get into it, let me say, if you guys haven't been to York Hall before, if there's anyone out there who's never been to the fights there, it's something I couldn't recommend doing more. It's a fantastic venue, goes without saying. I've been to a lot of the bigger bills in the past. I've been to David Hay fights, I've been to stadium fights, etc. But going to York Hall is a completely different experience. I mean, it's literally, you can feel the punches landing. You can see the snap and the speed of the hands. You can look at the intricacies of someone's movement in the ring. It's a completely different experience in terms of its intimacy. Clearly, it's a very hardcore boxing crowd who attend there. And I had a great night there, so I'd highly recommend that. And as it transpires, last night may well have been a slightly historic night in the sense that Enzo Maccariinelli appears to have had his last fight on the bill where he suffered a first round loss to Kucher. And hindsight is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Okay? And look, it's so easy to sit here with the benefit of hindsight and to criticise. But that's exactly what I'm going to do. And with hindsight, you have to question what on earth was Enzo Maccariinelli and what on earth was his team doing taking this fight. Enzo Maccariinelli was coming off a win against Roy Jones Jr. Now I know it's a faded Roy Jones, but nevertheless that is a big win. That is a huge name. Imagine if Eddie Hearn had a fighter coming off a win against Roy Jones Jr. He'd be pushing them towards becoming a pay-per-view star in the UK, let's be honest. And Enzo has gone from that win to fighting for the European title against an opponent with a 23-1-1 record, who went the distance with Maccariinelli, who had a high knockout ratio, who had never been stopped before. He's gone straight in with that opponent for very, very little reward. Very little reward. The opponent was an unknown quantity, high knockout ratio, never been stopped, appeared to be an extremely capable operator. And Enzo's fought him, coming off a career peak performance beating Roy Jones. Maybe not, when I say career peak, I mean in terms of the fame and the celebrity attached with that win. He's gone in there against a guy who's a dangerous guy. He's done it on 3 weeks' notice, stepping in as a replacement for Oval McKenzie. He probably hasn't had a full training camp for it, given the short notice. And what's worse is he's done it in front of a largely empty York Hall. York Hall was buzzing last night, but the truth is a lot of the tickets were sold by Anthony Yarde. There was a huge support for a prospect on the bill called Charlie Duffield. He sold a huge amount of tickets, and I think after Charlie Duffield took a loss, which we'll come on to later on in the video, the crowd went much flatter. The crowd was packed full of his fans, and when he took a loss, the crowd was a lot flatter, and a lot of people left the arena after that. And same with Anthony Yarde. Obviously Anthony Yarde won, which again we'll come on to, but a lot of people were there to see Anthony Yarde, and after that fight a lot of people left. So Enzo Maccariinelli came out on a Friday night at a half full York Hall. There was silence in the arena during the first round. Was there 500 people there at that point? Maybe. And he's gone out, and what reward would he have got for that fight? I know the European title was on the line, but if he'd have beaten Dmitry Kucher, would anyone have been impressed by that? Would that have increased his profile in your mind? Would that have made him more of a star? How much did Enzo get paid last night? I don't know, but fighting on a Friday night bill in front of a half-empty York Hall, unlikely to have been the money he's enjoyed in the past. And in hindsight, you've got to say, questionable matchmaking. And I say hindsight is a wonderful thing. Enzo could have blown this guy out, got an easy paycheck, but the guy looked very durable, he was experienced, he had a high knockout ratio, and it was difficult. As for the fight itself, Enzo came out and he was dominating the first round. Let me say this. Because I was ringside and because I got home late last night, I haven't seen any coverage of what any of the other YouTube channels have mentioned about this bill. I haven't seen any of the commentary that was on Box Nation last night. So it may be that you sitting at home will have actually had greater insights into what went on than myself, because I haven't caught up with any of this stuff, even though I was ringside. But to me, Enzo looked like he was dominating the first 2 minutes of the round. And I was sitting next to my brother, and I was saying to him, Kucher's just giving up the first round here. He's just having a look. But I was wondering, actually, was Kucher setting a trap? It looked like he was just happy to stand there in front of Enzo and lose the first round. And then right towards the end, he catches him. I think it was with a left hook. You could see Enzo was wobbled. And Kucher followed it up viciously. I think it was a right cross left hook combo. And Enzo was dropped badly. And I don't know what the referee was doing. And again, I don't know if this is something that's been criticised online or if it's something I've just spotted out. It looked to me that Gary Lockett in Enzo's corner was throwing in the towel. And rightly so, because Enzo was badly rocked. Lockett was standing on the ring apron with his hand in the ring waving a towel. I don't know what the referee was doing, but the referee counts Enzo up. I couldn't believe I thought Enzo had been down for 20 seconds, but he counted Enzo up and had a look at him. And I thought, oh my God, if he lets Enzo fight on here, this is just abuse. But thankfully he waved it off. But what he was doing, I don't know. But do you know what? I can't say I'm a massive Enzo Maccariinelli fan. I like Enzo Maccariinelli. What I mean is I'm not like someone who's followed his career massively. He's not one of my favourite fighters. But I left the arena last night with a real sense of disappointment, because it is sad to see a guy like him get sparked out like that in the manner that it happened against a fighter who, let's be honest, most of us won't have heard of before, in a dead arena. It's a sad way to go. It's not the way you want your career to end. And I hope he does retire, because his punch resistance has been in question for quite a long time, and I just don't think he's got it at the level he's going to need to have it at anymore, I'm afraid. So it's a real message to Enzo, and very disappointing for him and for his career. And I felt very, very bad for him, I must say. I felt very, very bad for him. Moving on, let's talk about the undercard. I didn't see the entirety of the undercard. I was coming from work, so I didn't get there straight away. But I saw some good fights. So let me start with Anthony Yarde. I guess he's the one who's most exciting. I really, really liked Anthony Yarde. I mean, he was in against an opponent last night whose record going into the fight was 1 win and 3 losses. So we have to get it into some sort of perspective. I mean, the opponent he was in with, Gregor's Semic, I think was the guy's name, was pretty terrible. And it was just target practice for Anthony Yarde. Yarde was very patient in there, which I liked. You got the impression he could have stopped his opponent in the first minute of the first round, but he didn't. He didn't compromise his technique just on the fact that he could smash the guy out of there. He boxed him. He's quite a smart boxer, Yarde. I like him in terms of the way he uses his jab. I like him defensively. He's got decent upper body movement and head movement. I'm not saying he's Floyd Mayweather. He was in against an opponent, who's got a 1-3 record at York Hall. But the shoulder was coming up. He was trying to roll. He was trying to move. He was a difficult guy to hit. And when his useless opponent did try and throw back, Yarde was able to get out of range quite easily. And Yarde looked really, really smart to me. And there was a viciousness to his game. He's a very, very interesting prospect. I think he's 6-0, 7-0 after this, and he's one to really, really follow. My main concern with Anthony Yarde is, whilst he's looking absolutely devastating at this level, is his lack of height, his lack of range. For a guy who's an out-and-out boxer, to my eye, for a guy who relies on the jab and movement and that kind of fighting, he is very short for a light heavyweight. Very short for a light heavyweight. And I want to see how he adapts his style when he fights guys who are a genuine light heavyweight size. Because I think that could potentially be a struggle for him. But he's an extremely exciting prospect. He's great to watch. He's got real power, real skill, good defence. I like him. I like him, and I'd pay to see him fight again. I would. But someone who I was possibly even more impressed by, funnily enough, in the same division, was Tom Baker. And Tom Baker is a guy who is exactly the kind of fighter, that Anthony Yarde could potentially struggle with when stepping up in class. We'd seen 3 or 4 undercard fights by the time Tom Baker came out. And the second Baker came out, and I'd seen him box before on Box Nation several times. He's 13-0 light heavyweight prospect. The second Baker came out, I thought, wow, this guy's a level above what we've seen so far tonight. And you could see him gliding around the ring. The way he was you're getting pinned back to the ropes, and he'd just sort of pivot off it, spin round, very light on his feet, excellent footwork. Obviously the opponent was extremely limited. The guy's record was 17 wins, 21 losses and 3 draws. Yeah, but Baker absolutely schooled him and hammered him with the jab. You know, the guy's eye was badly marked up. The referee waved it off in the corner after the 4th round, and to be honest, I could see him waving it off a round or 2 earlier, because this guy's eye was closed. You know, he was in a bad way. And Baker was, you know, a real class above. But what Baker has in there is, you know, he doesn't have the most crazy power. You know, his knockout KO ratio is very low, but he's just got the pedigree, the boxing pedigree, the skills, the movement, the jabs. You know, he seems to be a real talented fighter. Now, I think someone like him could cause Anthony Yarde real problems. I think my concern with Baker is twofold. One, if he gets someone who can get in his space and rough him up on the inside, I'd like to see how he'll deal with that. Secondly, when you look at a guy like Baker, you know, he's very good at what he does, but you don't tend to see him going through the gears. You know, he seems quite content to take his opponents late and, you know, not to push for the stoppage and not to grind people out. And that's well and good. You know, getting the rounds is good for experience, especially at this sort of level. But, you know, at the top of the sport, if you can take someone out, I think you kind of need to, because you're exposing yourself to risk of getting yourself taken out if you don't. So, you know, very interesting to see those two fighters, two real solid light heavyweight prospects in Baker and Anthony Yarde. Yarde in particular is an extremely marketable guy. Frank Warren needs to push him aggressively. Baker, for me, he's ready for a step up. You know, he should not be fighting 8-rounders against opponents with losing records. He's now 14-0. He looks to me to have the pedigree to be moving towards British title level. I understand that the British title belt will be contested between Hosea Burton and Frank Buglioni. That's a fight I'd expect Hosea Burton to win, but, you know, we were talking about it at ringside last night. Hosea Burton versus Tom Baker is actually a fight that we'd like to see. It's a real interesting matchup, actually. You know, one for the hardcore boxing fight, but, you know, that's an interesting one. I'd like to see him pushed in that direction, to be honest. Let me try and pick out a few other performances. Nathaniel Wilson, I don't know if he was shown on Box Nation. I think he's the guy who is Chris Eubanks' son, supposedly. He was in against Liam Richards, who was an extremely frustrating opponent to fight. You know, Nathaniel Wilson had only had 2 fights. Richard had had 25 fights. 35 fights. Even though he'd lost 23 of them, you know, he had that experience, and he was slippery as hell. I think Wilson had him down in the first round. Wilson did seem to carry some genuine power, and then Richards was content to sort of keep the distance, and what he was very, very good at was getting low. You know, as soon as Wilson would close the distance, he'd throw a punch, Richards would just duck under it and hold him. And to be honest, last night, and it was probably a sign of inexperience, I know Wilson's come to pro boxing quite late, he's 27 and this is his 3rd fight. He kind of struggled with an opponent who could bob and weave and get low, and you get that with these experienced, difficult journeyman types. But what I felt Wilson needed to do was double up his jab a bit more. And I also thought he needed to recognise that every time he threw a punch, his opponent, Liam Richards, was ducking under his shots and, you know, was going low. And I think Wilson could have adapted, and maybe instead of throwing punches to the head, which were making him look inaccurate, he could have maybe gone to the body. He could have maybe thrown shots to the chest, which are much harder to duck under. You know, so it was hard to sort of get a gauge on Nathaniel Wilson last night. You know, he won every minute of every round. Don't get me wrong, he performed with credit in that sense. It was just a little bit of an instinct that you'd like to have seen him adjust a bit quicker and try and do things a bit differently against this opponent. And, you know, potentially that was a sign of inexperience against the highly experienced journeyman. So there you go. Dan Carr, or DP Carr, for Andy Harris, who's an experienced journeyman with a 3-31 record. Again, Dan Carr won every minute of every round. You know, the journeyman boxed well, Andy Harris, but you know, Carr was clearly the aggressive fighter. He's sort of acting as a pressure fighter in there last night and bringing the action. He looked, to be honest, he looked quite green still for me, Dan Carr. I know he's 5-0 now. he looked quite green, and I think at this point he'd be vulnerable to a boxer. You know, lightweight division in the UK is fairly stacked. Is fairly stacked. You know, I know he's a long way off being 5-0 and not having fought anything above sort of journeyman level opposition, if you like. So I know there's time to develop him, but he looked a little bit rough around the edges for me. It wasn't the smoothest performance in there. I don't want to be overly critical on the guy. I thought there was a lot more to come from him, let's put it that way, in terms of stepping through the levels. So, yeah, he's one to follow, certainly. Obviously, he's undefeated, but I probably didn't watch him and leave with the same excitement in terms of his potential upside as I did with like a Tom Baker or an Anthony Yarde. Shall I pick out one or two other performances for you quickly? Leon Woodstock, I thought he was quite an interesting fighter. I saw on Twitter someone mention this, but to me, he looked extremely like Chris Eubank Jr. in terms of his style of fighting. And I'm not saying he's as good as Chris Eubank Jr., but everything from his swagger, his physique, the way he throws punches, you know, he looked really like Chris Eubank Jr. He actually boxed far more like Chris Eubank Jr. than Nathaniel Wilson did, entertainingly. And yeah, Wilson, I don't think he's necessarily the biggest puncher in the world, but he punches with real spite. You know, there's real snap there. And he's got bad intentions when he throws punches. You know, he very much wanted to blow this opponent out last night. And the opponent, Ronaldo Moura, who was 7-13 with one draw, performed with real credit. You know, that journeyman, I'll give him respect. You know, he was game as you like. He was tough as you like. He took some big shots and he kept coming forward. And he put Wilson under pressure one or two times. Sorry, Woodstock under pressure one or two times. But yeah, Leon Woodstock on the whole impressed me. You know, I thought he was an interesting fighter. I thought he was perhaps a little bit guilty. He's only 22, so he's got a long way to go. But I thought at times he was a little bit guilty of being over eager for the knockout. You know, often he'd come out from the round and start throwing absolute bombs. You know, clearly the gap in pedigree in terms of boxing here was vast. And yeah, I'd like to see maybe Woodstock be slightly less eager for the stoppage, work behind a jab. You know, box a bit more at range. You know, he seemed to have some decent boxing capability, and I'd like to see him using it more than just throwing haymakers. But I was impressed by Woodstock. You know, I'd like to see him fight again. Yeah, there was some people last night talking about him versus Conor Benn. And yeah, potentially if they have 3 or 4 more fight seats, that could be an interesting matchup. But yeah, he was an interesting guy, and he was in an entertaining fight, and he's the kind of guy you'd like to see again. At this point, like a young Chris Eubank Jr., very green, a little bit of inaccuracy, a little bit of over eagerness, you know, but the talent is there. I mean, he can get there. He can get there in the end, trust me. So the one fight I haven't talked about, Charlie Duffield versus Vladimir Idrani. And I've got to be honest, in terms of fights I've seen live, as in I've been ringside for, this is probably the best fight I've ever seen live. You know, I'll be honest, I wasn't really aware of Charlie Duffield before the boxing last night. But he had a huge support in the crowd. And he came out, and the crowd was going absolutely mental. And I looked at him, and he looked absolutely massive in there. You know, I was saying to my brother, how does this guy make light heavyweight? And sure enough, he actually had weighed in at 13 stone. His opponent, Vladimir Idrani, looked to me more like a super middleweight. He came to the ring wearing Thai boxing shorts. Quite spectacularly, he was without a protector. He had no groin guard. And my good mate Ian John Lewis, you could see him shaking his head in the ring, saying he couldn't let the fight continue without that. So, funnily enough, Charlie Duffield's corner to go and get him one. You know, and this guy, to me, I said that it just looked like he was about to get absolutely destroyed. You know, Duffield was the bigger man by far. He turned up in the wrong equipment, without a protector, wearing Muay Thai shorts. He had a record of 5 wins, 18 losses and 2 draws. And I thought, you know, he's going to get his head taken off here. And it transpired to be the fight of the night by some distance. Yeah, in the very first round, Idrani came out and put it on Duffield aggressively. You know, charged him down, forced the pace on him, and Duffield was uncomfortable. You know, I thought I'll be really frank, I thought Adjani may have stopped Duffield in the first round. You know, he looked rocked, and Duffield showed quite a heart to stay in that fight. You know, he showed real toughness, real heart, and he came back. And the thing is, Duffield actually appeared to have advantages in the fight. You know, when he was fighting with his jab, when he was boxing it, I thought he was having success. But this Adjani, and Adjani was horribly gassed for large proportions of this fight. You know, he would stand there at the end of Duffield's jab, try and stay out of range. You know, he was open mouth, too tired to keep his hands up, and then he'd just charge in with 3 or 4 combinations, and he was catching Duffield. You know, Duffield has got a lot to work on defensively. Adjani couldn't miss with the lead cross. You know, he's throwing a lead straight cross, and it was catching Duffield over and over again. You know, Duffield was eating some haymakers last night, and I saw him after the fight, and he was badly marked up. And credit to both guys, because it was a fantastic fight. But Ian John called the fight off in the 6th round. It appeared from ringside that Adjani had broken Duffield's nose with a hook, and yeah, there you go. But I've got to say, what a great fight it was. And had the fight gone the distance, by the way, I was definitely scoring it to Adjani. I had him 4 rounds to 2 up, maybe 5 rounds to 1 up. My brother had it a little bit closer, but overall the instinct was that Adjani had just about done enough to beat Duffield. It was a great fight. It would be a hard experience for Charlie Duffield, really. I felt bad for him losing like that. But there's a lot to work on there. He's got the heart of a lion. There's a lot to work on in terms of his defence and using his boxing. I also think if he slimmed down a bit, he was in fantastic gym shape, but he's a little bit static in there. He's a little bit stiff, and I'm wondering whether he's carrying a bit too much muscle mass on him. But there's a future for him if he can work on those things, definitely. But yeah, all in all, in summary, I won't ramble on for too much longer. It was a great night. Good to see some real exciting prospects in there. Some names like Anthony Yarde and Tom Baker, who I genuinely think will be competing at British title level at the very least, potentially with upside to go quite a bit further than that. And some, pretty solid prospects who I think will be ones to watch. Leon Woodstock probably immediately jumped out as me as a prospect to follow as well. So yeah, some interesting stuff. Obviously the Enzo result was probably not the result most fans were hoping for. Not the way you'd want to see his career end, but yeah, there you go. That's my thoughts on the event, guys. Some interesting people in the crowd. I saw Nick Blackwell in the crowd. I saw Oval Mackenzie in the crowd. So yeah, it's a good night all in all. And I'd recommend those kind of bills to anyone going forward. If you were there, let me know your thoughts. How did you rate it? If you watched it live on Box Nation, give me your thoughts. You may have a greater insight than I've done because you've seen the commentary and